As far as I know, it's 6:30, and I think we're ready to start the meeting, and we'll start the webcasting. So good evening and welcome to this meeting of the Overview Scrutiny Committee. I'm Councillor Mary Wheel, Chair of the committee and Chair of tonight's meeting. So we're being streamed live on YouTube, and members of the public and the media are welcome to watch. Before we start, I'd like to check that everyone's got their phones turned on. People or turned to silent, because we will start with 72 seconds of silence to remember those who lost their lives in the Grenfell tragedy. Thank you. Thank you. I have received apologies from absence from Councillor Knight and from Councillor Kamali and the Chief Executive tonight. Does anyone have an interest in declarations of interest? No. The minutes of the previous meeting that took place on the 11th of June have been circulated and attached. Are you happy that I'll sign them as a correct record?
Great.
Lovely. Pass them over to me. And I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to the action tracker. And I've spoken to Jackie about some of these which really need to be sort of pushed along, but they're just hanging around. But we did have a report on the one I particularly wanted to draw your attention to was the article, a report on DDT, including structure and future objectives. That was the sort of first item, but that I think can come off because having determined our workload, and we decided not to include that in it. But apart from that, we are going to chase all of those up. Because some of them which are quite slight, have been outstanding for too long.
Can I raise one?
Yes.
Which is number one about Maxilla report and visits. This morning, it's the subject. It's on the Maxilla report and visit. In the council tax and action plan update, is on next main paper under section 545 on page 45. It says that the Maxilla project is temporarily on hold, and therefore I suggest that what we do is receive the report on Maxilla that we've asked for. We decide then as to when a visit to Maxilla would be appropriate, because at the moment there is nothing happening at Maxilla according to this other paper.
There isn't, but I think we discussed the fact that maybe some people would like to. It's just come back to me now, but the discussion we had, that would just quite like to refamiliarise themselves with the inside of the building and what it looked like. I mean, I've been there a couple of times, but it's actually quite a long time ago. Sorry, Claire.
And it does mean that we will be ready. We would, when a paper does come, we will have already recently seen the building. So we do it sooner rather than later.
Oh.
I mean, I think some aspects of the project are clearly not going to happen in that space, but other aspects might. So I don't mind going to see it in September, and we could always organise a second one if you didn't want to go then.
Well, I certainly think that we'll need to do a visit when we know what is being proposed to go in there.
Yes.
Whether it's actually worth going to see an empty space at the moment.
So I think possibly what we'll do is we'll organise if anybody does want to go,
Yeah,
and then with the
fair enough.
proviso, complete understanding that once there is a plan, we'll go and visit it
I'm
again.
not trying to prevent anybody doing anything. I'm just suggesting.
But then, I mean, I can see what you're saying makes sense, but let's do much less.
Two visits instead of the price of one. How about?
Well, yes. One very informal visit for those of us who just want to reacquaint ourselves. Okay, that's perfect. Let's carry on. And the next item is item 4. We've got 2 items on our agenda. This is the Corporate Performance and Council Action Delivery Report, which provides an overview of council performance. And if you, as you all know, we see much more detailed and differently focused performance indicators within each of the committees. But this is an overall view of how the council is doing internal measures against three areas: what the council can't control in its environment but wants to see improving, what the council can control, and how what we're doing is reinforcing the council plan or indeed underlining it. Can I ask Jo Schultz, who is the Director of Grenfell Legacy and Corporate Strategy, to introduce it, and then I will invite questions.
Great, thanks very much, Council. This is Amy Springer, who works in the data team, and she oversees the performance reporting, and she's kindly joined us tonight to answer any specific questions. I think you gave plenty by way of introduction, Councillor Wheel, but just a reminder, this is a broader appointment as part of the Council's work particularly to embed some of the learning from the Grenfell tragedy about the importance of transparent reporting that both residents and elected members can interrogate. As you will know, this is the latest of many reports on corporate performance that you have considered. We've made a number of changes to the structure of the reporting. The report focuses both on the key activities in the council plan action plan, and that sits under the umbrella of the council plan. The last council plan action plan took us up to the end of March of this year, and in April the leadership team agreed a new council plan which is streamlined, so that will have an impact on the next report you see, which focuses on a smaller range of activities. But the performance framework, which I think Amy will tell you is kind of constantly under review. We're looking to capture, as you said, some of the key borough-wide indicators and some of the key council performance indicators. We've got 75 odd performance indicators in this report. We're not an expert in all of those areas, and indeed in most of those areas, so if there are specific questions, we might need to take those away, or indeed there might be specific issues you want some select committees to look at in more detail. But the hope here is both to get a sense of kind of what those areas are that we want to grow, and how we might continue to evolve the corporate performance framework to reflect some of the things that are most important to you as a committee. One thing I would say is I think one of the previously we discussed some of the implications of the Grenfell Tower inquiry commitments for our approach to corporate performance reporting. I think you challenged us to consider how we might measure some of the commitments we've made, what kinds of indicators we might look at, and what might tell us. And the piece of work that's going on at the moment is to look at this framework in light of some of that work, and also, which I think is a point that's been raised by the committee before, to look at ways that we can bring together performance reporting with some of the monitoring of risk and indeed finance. And I think that's particularly critical given some of the financial challenges that we face, given the implications of the fairer funding review, so that we can see the information about risk, performance and finance in the round. I'm not promising miracles kind of immediately on that, but I think we have a mature enough approach to performance reporting now that we can start to look at how we align it more closely with other sources of information.
Good, thank you. That's a timely reminder that Jay can't respond to all the kind of minute questions that we might have about road traffic accidents, for example, but that we can take them away, or Jay can pass those questions on. And also we need to bear in mind whether there are improvements or measurements that are left out that we think ought to be improved. So I'm going to try a new approach at this meeting, which is not to go round everybody, but to ask who would like to ask a question. And I see Will first, and then Sue.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions. First one is carbon zero is a major commitment to the council. I was unable to find, it's mentioned briefly under 29, 30 and 5.7. But the way it's mentioned does not deal with the main report that's needed in terms of progress. The ether report established that 90% of the council's carbon footprint within its buildings and social housing. And there is no progress report on the achievement rate for housing, which is 65 out of that 90. And I think it needs to be measured both in terms of achievement. The particular target is one called EPCC, which is the installation level. There's a lot of controversy around heat pumps and such like. So if you want to go back to environmental equity, 2 or 3 years ago, it set out response to that. All of that was accepted by the leadership team. Now, the other aspect of that, which is particularly important to measure, is the impact it has on people who are fuel poor because they're financially poor, that it enables them to live warmer in the winter than they can't afford. But that was the first point. The second point was high priority, particularly post-medical, of assessing fire risk. And I question as to whether we have enough capacity in our officers to measure fire risk assessments. And the particular case that I came across, I know we don't usually deal with individual cases, but it's where a school is unable to get fire door assessment at the moment because of lack of capacity due to an illness of a particular fire officer. One was thought in those circumstances that they service report in. I think your reference, thirdly, to performance risk and finance is particularly interesting, but also we need to be careful not to overlap with the audit and transparency committee.
Great. Thank you, Councillor Pascal. So to take those points in turn, I think on net zero, we can certainly come back with more detail, unless you've got it, Amy, on kind of the specific targets in housing and the breakdown of that, so that we can have more confidence that we're moving towards it. As you know, there have been kind of broader challenges around funding and the funding implications for net zero, but we can certainly report in more detail on that. On the fire risk assessment, so I noticed that the position has actually improved since in Q4, since Q3. I think there was quite a detailed discussion at the last meeting. I think there was a challenge around sufficient capability and capacity, but I don't think that is the driver for the outstanding fire risk assessments, which I think we discussed at the last meeting. But again, we'd be happy to kind of come back with a bit more detail on exactly what is happening there. And if there is, in the specific case of that school, if that was reliant on council fire expertise, then we're happy to pick that up with the relevant team to make sure it's dealt with.
And deal with you outside.
Yes, and we did mention to audit and transparency the same question. Absolutely important to be clear. I think sometimes though there's probably potential for helpful additional clarity on the audit and transparency committee being satisfied that the particular mitigations are being looked at either at the OB and Scrutiny committee or at one of the select committees, while they keep an overview of the overall strategic risks.
Thank you.
Sidney.
Thank you, Chair. Just to follow up on Councillor Pascal, page 34, where we've got, I think, paragraph 1 line. The second line down, it says that the overdue fire risk assessment is specific on the fire door replacements. This is something that I've talked about for the last 2 years, and I'm obviously extremely concerned. You look at the top box, first line at the top of page 34, PM009. We've got quite it's high priority for this fire risk assessment, but they continue to be way above the level that you set there, which is acceptable, which is less than 250. So I'm just concerned that if you're trying to, I think it says in the paragraph at the bottom, it's reviewed regularly and there's bi-weekly meetings. Is there anything else that you can do to be able to tackle this? Because it doesn't seem to be going down the level where people can feel comfortable that fire risk assessments, fire doors in this fire in particular, have to be looked at extremely seriously.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Anderson, and I can certainly ask that question. My memory from the last discussion, and as I say, the position has improved a bit since then, but I agree it's still well outside the target. Some of this is, as referenced in that paragraph in the report, is specifically about the fact that the rating is also reliant on leaseholder doors, which we have less control over, and so there's that is difficult to manage. And sometimes historically it's been about supply of fire doors, which have been very difficult to get hold of for anybody trying to procure them. But we're certainly happy to take that away. I think from memory, the last discussion that we had at the committee, the officers who were here spoke specifically about looking to make sure that the things that were classed as high priority overdue actions were indeed those of biggest risk. I think the team's approach has very much been to tackle the things that pose the biggest risk to safety of life. That isn't necessarily everything that's covered by high priority overdue actions, which doesn't mean they're not important. It just means it's about where the team focuses their efforts first. But I think what I would suggest is that certainly a performance metric that we want to keep within the framework, and that if that trend does not continue to go down in the first quarter of the new financial year, we would want to go back to the drawing board in terms of what we're doing.
So just to finish off then, in future metric reporting, is it possible to have doors that are not with leaseholders, so what I would call council controlled doors, so that you can show it's close to either 99 or 100% because you control all of those doors, and then leaseholder doors at a much lower level because you don't control those doors, so that we can see that on the bits that you have 100% control of, council doors, you're very high level of confidence because you're controlling things. So that would be my suggestion if you were going to, without going too granular, try and spell it out, but it isn't very clear. Of the 6,600 council properties, which doors do you control that you haven't yet changed, for example?
And there may be, I don't know this, but there may be a way of asking about the categorisation of those high priority overdue actions in a way that might give the committee more information about what we're talking about. Obviously, everything related to fire safety is important, but I think being able to see where the majority of the actions are coming from, if that's possible, might be helpful to the committee.
And then my final question, if I may, Chair, if I can take to page 49, the bottom paragraph, which is talking about the Oracle system. Second bullet point would appear to be praise required because you've got an award, silver and gold at the Oracle User Group awards, which obviously is fantastic. So my question is, now that the system has gone live on the 15th of April, we've heard from Councillor Pascal before that there are a lot of councils have problems with the Oracle system. I think I mentioned before Birmingham City Council had huge problems. I think sometimes £750 million was caused by the Oracle system. What are we doing now that it's been implemented in terms of keeping tabs on it, making sure that it's fit for purpose and there is nothing?
Can I just jump in there, because I think we've got a committee report coming in September.
That's right, yeah.
On the implementation of Oracle and where we're at. So that's probably a good time to ask those questions.
Okay.
Because we'll have a proper report with us and the right officers to ask them.
Fine. Okay. No problem. Thank you. I'll come back to my third question.
I can only speak as a user of the system, Councillor Yankson, so yes, but it seems to be going well from what I've heard, but I think probably best to get an update from the relevant officers.
Perfect. In that case, as we're going to have that question, I'll go to my final question, which is just looking at the crime statistics on page 35. I note that there's some increases in hate crime, but in relation to antisocial behaviour, where are we with trying to tackle that either on council's footprint or in the more public spaces in general?
Yeah, thanks, Councillor.
5.20 and 5.31.
And I think that's probably one for me to take away and ask the community safety team more about in terms of how. Both in terms of that decrease and understanding some of the potential reasons for that, whether that's a result of some of the activity that's been, some of the action that's been taken, but also in terms of overall management of antisocial behaviour. So I'm happy to take that away.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
We just saw Tracy next and then Joanna.
Thanks, Chair. Chair, I would just like to slightly expand on what Councillor Pascal said about the net zero, etc. It's very commendable, the net zero achievements for schools across the borough. But just to be aware, that given the funding constraints coming forward, that we are aiming actually achievable targets going forward. Because is it really realistic? The other point I would also like to make is after the fire risk assessments, there on page 37, there's a mention that the progress on kitchens and bathrooms program. Now I know this is not for you, but to take it away, it implies that it's good progress. But how is this measured? And what I hear from residents is not particularly, that there are lots of problems, so I would quite like some details on that one. And on page 41, the housing table, maybe I'm misreading it. The first metric, number of households in temporary accommodation, it says 10% annual decrease. But then it tells you by numbers. So what percentage is it? Or am I misreading this?
Thanks, Councillor. Just to take that last question first, I think that's 10% increase on the sort of figures as they were.
As they were a year ago. And do we know what they were a year ago? I mean, it's
I don't have it to hand, but it would be between 0 and 10%. That would probably what has given it the amber rating.
Yeah,
right.
So, but we could probably going forward we can include the previous year.
So just as a reminder, sorry, it's just.
No, that's and then on the questions about kitchens and bathrooms, could you just remind me which paragraph you're?
Yes, it is. Sorry, it's page 37.
Yes.
And it is. It's 8. No, it's 8. So 5.26, right at the top.
Yeah.
The Borough-wide kitchen and bathroom scheme.
Yes.
Program.
Yeah, so that want to definitely ask my housing management colleagues about. I know they kind of timescales for that are set out as part of the capital programme. So I totally appreciate that there are residents who are still, many residents still waiting for those kitchen and bathrooms to be done, and indeed other things like windows. I think there is a broader problem which is captured at 5.27, which is the challenges we face meeting some of the decent home standards, and that work. Partly as a result of the initial focus on safety in the immediate aftermath of tragedy, there has been slower progress, and it's one of the areas that we were concerned about in relation to the social housing regulator. But I'm happy to ask, and indeed there may be other members of the committee who are more familiar with this than I, but I'm happy to ask for an update on kind of how far through that programme we are and what's left.
And even on the provider.
Yes.
Thank you.
Let's check if Joanna next and then Greg.
Go to the details first. So on page 45 at 544, we talk about the digital inclusion. And in there we talk about activity to continues to be rated amber in 44 as resources in place is insufficient to coordinate and deliver the schools and support requirements to meet the needs of the key resident groups. What's happening now?
Thanks, Councillor Gardner. I will ask about that project, I suppose, and come back with a fuller answer. I think one of the challenges we've had with the existing council plan action plan is that we haven't always clearly set out the kind of milestones and the goals and the outcomes from those activities. It's an issue we've tried to address in the new plan by being kind of more focused so that it's clearer when we're not hitting that target, because the point that Councillor Hudd raised about net zero is another good example. Is what we're setting out a kind of an ambition, or is it kind of, to your point, Councillor Pascal, progress towards a specific goal? And I think we need to do the same here, but I'm happy to ask what we are doing as a result of that on digital inclusion.
Moving to page 37. Again, paragraph 526. It also came up in the Housing Scrutiny Committee that such is currently costing £1 million per flat. And it also comes through in the later paper about the financial position, that actually the contract is still in a state of flux. And I don't actually know if that cost is increasing even further. So for me, I feel we're being a little bit light touch in this report, because I think it's going really well.
Can I come in on that much?
Yes, well,
So I think.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Excuse me. Chair, may I come in on that one, please?
Of course you can.
So there are two things of Silchester. There's one which is Silchester Arches, which I think is the first one that you referred to there, and I think this is the Silchester Major Works at 5.2.6. which is, as it says here, an extremely complex undertaking, and not without its problems and difficulties. And some people don't have a kitchen at all.
So
right now.
perhaps we could elaborate or make it clear that there's a difference between the two. That would be particularly helpful. Thank you. And then my fundamental question, you go to page 27, 5.1, 5.3, for indicators. If I looked at this, and I was on the wire from reading paragraph 5.2, because I looked at those RAG ratings, and it was sort of, and it meant nothing, because it was just, when I read bar, it was 18 borough indicators, 8 are improving, 44%, 3 are maintaining, and 7 are declining. So you kind of, I still, that's an overall summary, but I don't have any meat on that bone. But I do fundamentally question how effective scrutiny is, Madam Chairman, today, that you're just taking lots of these questions away to come back on. And I question to what extent we either need the right officers here, or we delegate the pieces to the individual select committees. And I've certainly seen this before, and I'm trying to get in my mind whether it was audit or having a community scrutiny committee, because I've had both in the space of a week. So I've seen some of these before, and I've gone into the detail. But I'm actually really disappointed tonight that it's you, Joe, only you, as opposed to people who can ask the question. And it's even me asking, what is scrutiny tonight, as opposed to Joe taking away a list of actions.
I think we're looking at the overall council performance in a sort of coherent way, or hopefully a coherent way. And as I alluded to, we've got our own sets of KPIs within the various select committees, which go into a lot more detail. And I agree. I mean, I said at the beginning that, Joe has to go away with a lot of these detailed questions and come back to them. But I think it's a report, which is an outward-facing report about how we as a council are performing. It's right that we scrutinise it. And also, part of some of the comments I want to make about this is how we improve this paper and make it more readable and more digestible to residents, for example, who I hope some of whom will read this and hold us to account with it. So I think I completely understand and I do think there are some ideas in here which we should be taking back to our select committees, perhaps for reports and things. I was thinking, for example, the one I wanted to raise was on the number of accidents, which seems to be rising despite the fact we've got a 21-mile limit. So that's something that maybe ought to go back to the Environment Committee. So while I share your concern, I'm hoping that Joe will send us an email updating us on the questions that we've raised, but that we're getting an overall picture. And if we think that that's not the way to go, in the long term, you've raised the question, then maybe we look at it again. But that, for me, is the rationale.
That's one question. If that's the case, what I'm not clear in this report is which elements don't go back to a select committee or don't get picked up, and which elements are specifically for out. So it would be very helpful in the future to actually have ours set out. And I don't know whether actually ours will be at the top because they're the most interesting. But it would be very helpful to see what doesn't get scrutinised by some other committee, as opposed to those sections that may.
So what you'd like to see are
within our scope. Yes.
Okay. Well, we can look at that. Yeah.
Thank you.
But also, just to point, Councillor Gardner, that the broader point is: are we doing enough through this report to give you a picture of what we think on the basis of the information that's presented here, the indicators, kind of are the biggest challenges, issues, risks facing the council? And I think I've heard clearly tonight that we're not, because I guess that's also the purpose of these meetings, is so that you, as it were, can kick the tires on whether you feel that officers and the leadership teams are focusing their attention in the right places in terms of the way that we're assessing some of the key areas of risk in terms of performance.
I assure you, Joe, it's nothing personal.
No, not at all. Not taken personally at all.
You're still looking quite cheerful. But thank you very much for that point, because it can only help us to go. No. Oh, sorry. Great, no, my fault.
I will take the place that you originally offered me, because I want to follow on, and my apologies, Mo, but because the couple of points that I was going to raise have come up, and Joe will be pleased to know I don't have any questions for you. These are just observations. So for the most part, I agree with what Joanna has set out. In terms of the road casualties, that is something that leaks out of here, but something was discussed in the Environment Select Committee at great length in March, and it will be discussed again next year when we get the same set of statistics for the new year. think our borough's offices didn't have an explanation for it, but we had a long discussion about it, so it was probably aired. Likewise, waste and recycling comes out in this report, and again, that's a subject that the Environment Select Committee considers at length and in September meeting this year, and as it always is such an important point. I think my point about tonight's report, and my audience for this would be Maxine if she's not here. I know she normally attends here. She knows my views, and the lead member who also knows my views on this. Is we're still beating ourselves up too much about things that are out of the council's control. So, for example, the NHS's smoking target, which is tangentially to do with the council, is mostly the NHS's target. How many people are visiting the borough's museums, or the museums that are in the borough, as opposed to the museums that are owned by the borough? Very important distinction there.
Yes.
And I just not sure that we should be worrying too much about the things that are out with the council's control, particularly when we're facing a potentially catastrophic financial settlement. And we really are going to have to focus on what the council's job is, and not all these tangential things that happen within our borough, and actually concentrate on what to deliver. I think this report is probably focusing as too wide-ranging and not focusing narrowly enough on the things that are in our control. But I can assure you that the Environment Select Committee is focusing on the things that are mentioned in here that are important.
Good, thank you. Mo.
Thank you. And Maxilla Development, page 45. I recently joined this committee, and I believe you have had a detailed discussion on this when I wasn't a member of this committee. If I remember well, this project came about after Grenfell, and it was through the discussion then we agreed that this site will be dedicated for community use. And the adult social care element was ruled out, if I remember well. But now it's still on the agenda. So what are we going to bring this back to the committee and talk about it in the near future? Or what's happening with this site?
We've recently had a report on Maxilla, and we're due to have another one in September. Yeah.
Okay.
So it is very much on the agenda. And I think the last report we had raised some very serious concerns about the suitability of the building, particularly for the adult social care element of it, which I think made the lead member go away and think about that quite hard, which is why there's a bit of a pause, I think. But as I say, we will see a report in September, and there's a bit for those of us who want to remind ourselves what the space is like and its limitations, because one of the limitations is the fact that it's underneath the Westway and it needs to have inspections and there are pillars everywhere. But we can go and familiarise ourselves with it in September anyway.
Are you going to do a site visit?
Yes, that's what I mean. Yeah,
Okay.
in September, as well as having a report in the September site. Toby.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, I'll just start with the overall question that I'm sort of left with is I've been thinking this with the work group on as well. When I read a lot of this data, I mean, by its nature, some of it is broken down because we're talking about council stock, but what I'm usually left with, just as an overall note, is, well, we're such a famously, well, depending how you like to put it, unequal, diverse or heterogeneous borough. Demographics are so different in different wards and different parts that so usually I find a much better picture of when you see the either by ward or by. So I suppose my overall note would be I would like to see things which were sort of just broken down in that way off the from the jump. That would be generally more helpful for me. And I have a few. So the question about safer homes, which is. Now, this isn't directly in our control, but it's our contractors, it's our registered providers. Do we have registered provider information in terms of safety, in terms of gas and all of these sorts of things? That will also be useful, and also, of course, they have budget implications because these are people that are that are providing our social responsibilities. My question about PM010 is, what is the top quartile for London? I've actually not written these, looking at in my notes. I have to go back to Excuse me, I'm jumping between my laptop and my physical version. It's one of the ones where, yes, it's overall tenant satisfaction. Yeah. The target is the top quartile for London, but we don't have RAG information available yet, so I'd be interested to know what that quartile is. I'm just racing through these because they might not all require a comment, but I'd like to also, I'm not quite clear. There are notes about it. PM099 is housing stock, housing stock, decent home standard, which is 71%. It's about the fire safety initially mentioned, and if when I've got to the end of my questions, you could just maybe clarify that for me a bit. It is mentioned, but it's not quite clear enough for me anyway, not in the level that I've read it. And I'm going to end with, I think very quickly, second actually, Councillor had kitchens and bathrooms. I would like it, I'm surprised that people are saying they're satisfied, and that's not been my experience. So I want to take that away. And the last question is really just about definitions which you use for data in three specific ways. One is about 3.01, which is mobility within housing stock, housing for those who need it. Is that about the housing swap system, and what is that, and why is it green, 4 quarters in a row? I don't quite understand why, and just what it means really. Second definition is about tenancy fraud within council stock. Because I've always been a bit cynical about that, well, a bit skeptical, should we say, about exactly what that entails. The last one is 5.0, which is hate crime. I mean, I think hate crime, just in terms of how it's defined, because it's my understanding that hate crime is it's something that's already a crime, but it's exacerbated by its, by the identity, whatever it is. So I'd really like to know what the actual functional definitions that are used in collecting that data are. I can see you've written all of those down, seem to be nodding along, so I think I've made enough sense. If there's particularly the thing about the decent home standard, if you can just set me straight about the. But yeah,
Was that on PM099?
That's correct. Yeah.
What do you know? What page will?
No, I just have to do a little control F.
Great. So just to take those points in turn, and I might rely on Amy for a couple of those, if that's okay. And the challenge around kind of data by ward is really interesting one. We'll certainly take that away and think about how we might reflect some of that. It also relates to a challenge that the community I know has raised before in I think in the context of the discussion about the fair action plan, in terms of being assured that where we're measuring kind of performance of our services, we're looking at across the whole across the borough, and not just concentrated in some wards. So happy to take that away. It's also something that we're hoping to be able to look at through the resident survey, which is underway at the moment, and I think we've tried to design the approach so that we can draw some conclusions based on ward, not just kind of borough wide, to understand some of those different patterns. So I think it's certainly something we could look to reflect throughout the approach reporting. Top quartile in London, we'll come back to you with that figure if that's okay, Councillor Benton, but that is we've got last year's figures, but not this year's figures, so it will be last year's quartile, and we'll check that. PM099 is 5.26. That was the question. 27, sorry, and that was the question about the non-decency figure. Sorry, remind me.
Well, it's I think the target is 89. We're at 71%, and it's mentioned later in the notes on it that this is to do with self-referral over fire. Right. I'm sort of just saying the words that I remember rather than sort of putting together in the right order, which is really partly just reflects that I haven't quite absorbed it. Which is what I'm asking.
Yes, so overall that is in relation to kind of delivering on the Social Housing Regulation Act requirements, and that is a council plan action plan commitment that we've said we would do. Obviously, we've had the social housing regulator inspection, and we will get the result of that later that year. So that will give us a much stronger idea. I think where we had identified two areas of vulnerability or weakness that we'd identified in our approach was one around the Decent Home Standard, which, as you know, is a kind of government standard that we have to meet. And we recognise that partly because of the investment in the kind of historic neglect of the homes in the borough, and because of the initial investment in safety after the fire, that we were behind on the trajectory in relation to decent homes, so that we were unlikely to meet the regulators' requirements in relation to decent homes. And then secondly, on the FRA actions, I think we have had quite a lot of back and forth, including some referrals to the regulator where we have been concerned about issues. As we discussed previously in relation to the fire risk assessments, it looks like those are starting to come down, but it's important to kind of maintain that trend. So I think we felt, the view was from the service, that the big weakness was the decent homes figures in relation to meeting those specific requirements set out in the social housing regulation. And then kitchen and bathrooms, I think that I've heard clearly that we need more granularity in terms of where that feedback is coming from, how we're measuring it, and then mobility. Do you know, Amy, the mobility within so housing, which is I think it refers to the sort of the turnover within the stock, and ensuring that we make sure that people are people who need, for example, smaller homes, larger homes, that we're keeping that moving, but we'll make sure that we come back with the specifics on what we're measuring.
As a note, mine on that pretty quickly.
Very quickly, because then I want to move on to plans.
Absolutely. It's that also in the environment with the council and over, and I mean that turned up some similar questions about tying with the difference between, you know, different wards, different sectors. Like our sector, actually, when we were talking about amalgamations and how that actually has very different implications, but it's overcrowding in the social sector, which is completely different to what kind of anti-homes we have, which are 3, 4 plus bedrooms. So that's my note on what you said. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Chair. I've got a few questions. I'll go through and be as quick as I can. Thank you. First of all, I wanted to follow on, actually, Toby's kind of raised this, but I was looking on page 37 about the poor health figures in particular. It seems to be rising. And again, because this is all in the context of the council plan, action plan, and the fairer action plan, it's quite difficult to see. I think what isn't captured here is the disparity in life expectancy between, say, Holland Ward and Nottingham. So I see you've taken that, but I just wanted to flag that, and it's coming from a different place as well. And I also wanted to ask on page 50, which is 5.0, seems to be the Charter for Public Participation, which is green in that table. Looking at paragraph 5.55, I'm not quite sure, I don't follow how the council's response to the GTI engagement work makes that become green. But that's another one. I wanted to ask also quickly about looked after children, which relates to page 39. And I was concerned whether or not do we have metric on preventing and responding to child sexual exploitation. I don't know if we do or don't, but I think given the current national conversation, I think we maybe ought to. I also wanted to ask about the resident survey that's referred to on page 57. I personally would love to know more about what's in it and how is that being decided. And as I'm asking that question, I'm wondering with my fellow housing community select committee member here, whether this would be something that the communication consultation working group might like to be looking at as well. So I should throw that one out there. And I think on page 41, this is the last one, which is about homelessness duty acceptances. It would be great if someone from housing was here to answer this, and I don't expect you to necessarily know the answer, Joe. PM 084, the number of homelessness duty acceptances seems to have a target of below 60%. I find that slightly incompatible with being a fair council, and also following legislation, because surely each case should be ironed, and that would not lend itself to such a target. So maybe that 60% means something else. But that's a question that I'd like to be asking to Dan, maybe from my committee.
Yes, maybe better measure would be successful appeals against. Joe, you've got a menu there to respond to.
Yes, thank you very much, Councillor Simmons. And on the poor health point, I think again it's an area where we could draw out some of the disparities across the borough. And it's worth saying that partly in response to the challenge from this committee, along with the Fair Action Plan, we are looking very closely, particularly in light of the recent audit that we've had, at the data that we are gathering on the Fair Action Plan, what we will measure. So I think we would fully anticipate that we'd have a kind of subset of measures which would tell us about what was happening to inequality in the borough, some of which we would want, depending, as Councillor Hammond said, on the balance between kind of wider indicators and performance indicators, in order to know whether what we're doing in that space is making a difference. And I think it's a good challenge on the chance for public participation. I think the reason that it's green is because we've committed to, and indeed inaugurated, a full review of the charter. So, but I agree that that is not necessarily an indication that it has been sort of done or complete. And I think that what, again, it speaks to that concern to have some slightly more specific milestones around some of that activity, so that we're clear at the outset what we're trying to achieve, when we will know when it's done and what we will measure as a result. So I'm hoping that the next report for the new council plan will be clear, and you'll be able to see for those council plan, obviously for performance metrics we have targets, but for the council plan activity we will have a clearer sense of what we're aiming to hit, and then there can be a more objective judgment about whether we have got there or not. Looked after children, I was certainly asked about child sexual exploitation. My guess would be that, like a lot of the measures for children, some of the numbers would be too small to be meaningful, but we can certainly ask what is measured, indeed what the children's report to Ofsted and other regulators as well. Or the resident survey. So the resident survey is underway at the moment. The commitment has been to do something on an annual basis. And absolutely, there would be scope, I think, for the committee to look at the kinds of questions that are asked. A lot of them are kind of standard questions that are asked across the local government sector, but there are some specific ones that are added, and there is scope to change those and evolve those in the future. The priority was to try and get the survey out and to get that first round of data, but absolutely, I think the team would welcome, whether it's here or at the Housing Community Select Committee, a discussion about that. And we'll come back on acceptances. My assumption is that is.
So I think I can probably answer that one actually. So it's about the route that the cases go down. So I think the reason the target is less than 60% is because you would want that case to be dealt with by another route before it gets to main duty. So whether that is prevention of homelessness or relief of homelessness.
But again, more granularity might help us.
A better definition as well. Nice. Thank you.
Greg, do you want to follow up?
Just follow up on the borough survey. Seems to have quite a short window to fill in, but I don't know when it opened. But it does seem to end quite suddenly on the 2nd of August. Am I right about that? Because I wouldn't mind giving it some publicity, but my next opportunity is the 1st of August.
It's 2nd of August, yeah.
Yeah, so I wouldn't be able to publicise it before 1st of August.
And we can look at that deadline. Yeah. So it's worth, just for the committee's benefit, there is a company undertaking that survey and seeking to find a representative sample. What we have also said is that we would open it up to anybody else who wanted to participate. So we'll have those two data sets, essentially the kind of representative sample, but we can certainly look at it.
You don't want to publicise, I don't have. I could put it in my ward newsletter.
Yes, and I did send something which should have gone to all councillors about the survey last month, I think, but yeah.
It's too late for the 1st of July, and the next one's the 1st of August.
So we're happy to take that away and look at deadlines.
Mary, could I come back with something actually on we've heard from several councillors around the table about the subject matter one, which was the fire risk assessment. Now, I know Joe will take us away and come back with a full answer, but I'm wondering whether in this instance it'd be useful for us to sharpen it up to a recommendation or something else, because I think the message needs to go from this table to the lead member straight away, whether it's via a formal recommendation from this table or by some other means. But the lead member review this situation and ensure that sufficient fire risk assessment is in place. Because it's actually holding up schemes which have got money to do the schemes, but they can't be done until the fire risk assessment is done. So it's a sort of.
Yep, I think that sounds like a good idea, but say that's a recommendation.
Yeah. So to the lead member, yeah. Is that,
Yeah,
Johnny?
we can do that.
Is that Johnny Thalassitis now?
No, it would be soft.
Well, fire risk assessment goes across schools as well.
So yeah, I think I need to check who schools
If you
are
check,
relying on to,
or maybe
do
it's both.
those
I think it's
assessments.
probably to both of them. Especially after Grenfell, we should do that in stone unturned.
Good. Right, I had a few comments, and one is about the hierarchy in this report, which I think is really confusing. So you, there are basically 4 subsections covering the 4 things, but they don't get proper headings and they don't get new paragraphs. So, and they are distinct sections. So, for example, on page 28, greening, key achievements in classroom. That is the introduction to the whole section on greening. It's in very small letters. It doesn't have a page of its own, and it doesn't have paragraph number of its own, and the paragraphs after it don't descend from it. And it just, hierarchically, it's very confusing. 2 typos on page 29, I think, just to point out really quickly, not done on. PM128 typo, spelling typo, and one under, and then PM007, the litter index score. I think you've got one of the colours wrong there. But I just leave that with you. We don't need to dwell on it. And I was just wondering whether we, in Appendix C, talking about what other indicators we could have, what about one other indicator that maybe we need in the green a bit is dumping. We're dumping on the streets. We've got the litter index score, which is important. Potentially a type on it. But also I wanted about the amount of dumping, because there seems to be quite a lot at the moment, and I just think it's an important part. We pride ourselves on how our streets look, so let's put it in our indicators. And I know everybody's really interested in enforcement and how we enforce on our streets. And I wondered if in Appendix C there might be space for how many I don't know how many litter fines we issue in a month, or how many breaches of the noise barriers, that sort of thing. Because people are just interested that we are staying up to date on that and have a bit of a grip. So those were my only observations. Given that I think this report, despite recognising that it's here to stay, partly reflect on the council action plan, and I know the leadership team will want to be holding themselves to account for that. We should at least make sure that it's as accessible as it can be. Those are my superficial comments. Is there no other method comments in the committee? With those that recommendation, which Jack has noted. Thank you very much, and we will move on to the next point.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And we're now going to move to the review and long-term report. And we have.
Someone dropped something. Just my eyes are going to get to that big flash of pink for that.
And for this, we have Jen's apologies, just to remind everybody, and we have Lisa. Lucy. Do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, happy to. Thank you, Chair. So this is the final term position for the financial year 24-25, finished at the end of March. This report is important to note. We brought it to the leadership team last week. The timing, I'm afraid, didn't allow for it to come here first. We agreed that with the Chair. Just to draw your attention to the fact that we did publish the draft accounts by the 30th of June, which was a really good achievement by the team, given that we only went live with Oracle on the 15th of April, and we had to get the data out of the new Oracle system to do that. So I think that was a really good achievement. We are now going through the audit of that, and we'll bring that back through Audit and Transparency Committee. I'm not going to go through the report in lots of detail. I'll take questions, but to note that we did actually have an underspend in the revenue budget last year, and we moved that into the budget stabilisation reserve, which is obviously a good position for us, given that lots of councils across London and across the country weren't able to balance their budgets last year. Obviously, this year, the year we're in now, we've got a number of savings that we need to deliver against. So times are difficult, and we're aware of the funding reform consultation that's going on at the moment, which makes things even more difficult for years ahead. But I'm not going to go into that today. This is looking at the outturn report. I'm happy to take any questions, of course.
Thank you very much. Who'd like to ask? Great.
Thanks very much, Chair. Thank you, Liz, for your team for the report, and it's ended up being a strong position despite our share of London's temporary accommodation crisis. And I was very pleased to see that we've spent some Section 106 money as well, and during the year on our capital projects, so that's good. The question I want to focus on is the planned savings. We realised 86.6% of the planned savings, according to your figures, and that strikes me as being a bit on the low side, and I'd like a little bit more detail, please, on that. I know you do set out something in the report, but perhaps you can talk about that, particularly is the Resources Directorate, which is the main source of the shortfall, and maybe we should reflect and the future savings round that when we're budgeting, that should we be budgeting that we're only going to achieve 87, 85% of whatever savings we put in, and perhaps overshoot the target to make sure that we do deliver the actual cash savings that we can go into. So over to you, Liz.
Yeah, thank you. So Appendix 3 of the report details all of the savings, as you recognise. So I'll pick up on the ones that are marked red. I actually think it's quite a good delivery of savings. So 87.6% delivered. Of that, that's £11 million out of 12.6 million. So it's disappointing that we didn't deliver more, but given how difficult the were, before they entered the programme and the budget in the first place, we did challenge them to make that they are deliverable, but sometimes, as you know, things slip. So the big ones in the resources department are around soft FM procurement. So there's a bit of a delay there. Obviously, that's now happened and we've secured that contract. So we're seeing the benefits of that now as we move forward. Likewise, with the customer relationship management, we are now working on some of the CRM stuff has gone live. So again, that's a timing delay. Facilities management, again, in housing and social investment and incomes from letting of dwellings under a new home. So there's a few things there that are generally happening, but they're just a bit delayed. So, we're expecting them to happen in future years.
And how does 87.6% compare to previous years? I probably ought to know the answer to that, and I probably could have looked back at previous papers. What's your stuff? Was it low, high, about right?
It's pretty similar. I'll definitely get you the figures. We've only started really building savings in this way in the last year or two. Previous to that, we didn't break them down into this level.
I think it was in this committee that we started asking
this committee
percentages of achievement, just so that we can keep a track on that.
And ask questions like this.
And ask questions like this. And it's a bit, in a sense, it's a bit like the capital spending. Do you set out your programme and then top slice it by 10% and say there's always a bit that we don't spend? We don't achieve.
We're not going to say.
Yeah, and similarly, do you say, okay, we're going to start, if we want to save 12 million, we have to budget to save 13 million. But then, of course, that creates perverse incentives as well.
It does, and I suppose that's my question to Lisa is, should we do that latter course for the savings?
So in 2023-24, we had savings of 11.8 million to deliver, and we delivered 9.9. So we're in the same kind of ballpark figure as we were the previous year. But it's a good challenge as to whether we should look at only delivering or only budgeting to deliver 90%. But I think we need to bear that in mind as we go forward.
I'm sure the lead member will be watching the recording on YouTube and pick up my points.
No doubt, glued to it. Sydney.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question on page 82. Table 5 which talks about capital projects with slippage over 500,000. Just wanted to try and understand when there is slippage, as you describe it here, isn't that referred to in the contract so that the burden is on the supplier rather than on the council? And if not, why are we meeting what looks like £10,558,000 worth of costs to us because contracts have slipped? Is that a contract management issue? Is that something that should have happened internally? Because it just looks as if projects are slipping and we're bearing the brunt for that. Why isn't that reflected in the contract? I don't understand that.
But that's not additional costs to us. That's budget that we plan to spend that we haven't spent in the year of 24-25, and we've slipping into 25-26. So it's not us bearing additional costs. It's us having set monies aside, not spent it, so moving it into the following year. Each contract will be written differently, but that's not a cost to the council in that table.
So it's a technical term when you say slippage.
It's financial slippage, it's budget slippage, yeah.
So it's a period of time slippage.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we plan to spend it in the year for whatever reason. Maybe we didn't start the project quite on time, or the profiling of spend is slightly different than the forecast, and therefore it's moved from 1 year. So there's not an additional cost to us.
Pretty good. Sorry, thank you, Chair. Lisa, on this one, I have the same concern because you say the slippage. I know it's financial, but surely it's not been identified if we've delayed the project or it's been delayed by the contractors, so we don't really know. And when you revisit that contract in the following year, whenever, it's all going to be repriced. For instance, and there's an example in the previous paper, in the capital program, Handel Chapel, that's been delayed. So surely the cost will, there is a cost implication going forward.
So there might be a cost implication if we are, say, renting a different property whilst we're waiting for the capital programme to deliver. But what we're looking at here when we're referring to slippage is slippage of the sustainability programme. We obviously have more detail around all of these projects within the capital programme office. And if you want to pick out a particular scheme and understand why there's a slippage, so is it delay in starting? Is it a delay with a problem with the project, or is it actually something else? Then we can pick the individual schemes and get the information on those. Sure.
Sorry, Chair. Maybe I'm being dim here. So if we talk about the whole capital scheme, the 10 million, 10.5 million that we're talking about. So how would that figure be represented going forward?
So when we set the budget in the first place, we would have set it for 24-25. We don't spend it, so we will transfer it. And when you see Q1 25-26, you'll see that added to the capital programme to be spent against that project.
But that would be a realistic figure. That would be revised.
It would depend if it needed repricing.
Yeah, we would have to look at why it's
almost most of the time, right?
Generally, it's timing of the project just not happening, because quite often these projects are really complex, and the programme team and the project team will be estimating when they think they're going to incur costs when they set it up. So there is generally and regularly slippage on programs.
So historically, slippages has it always, what is the range? Has it increased by, or has it stayed static? So I think that's quite important.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, a few years back, this council had much greater slippage. I'm looking to council wheel there, yes. But it had much greater slippage. So I think we've put in place quite a lot of processes,
strategies like that to try and reduce.
With the rigour we've put around the capital programme office to try and make sure that we are holding the budgets to the right years. So you'll always get slippage on capital programmes, but we are trying to reduce that down to make sure also we wouldn't borrow if we're borrowing monies until we actually need to incur it. So we're not incurring borrowing costs on that early. It is just moving the budget from one year to another due to timing delays generally.
But what we are doing is reducing our revenue spend because we're budgeting to spend, even if we're not actually spending it, we're budgeting to spend to cover the capital cost or to cover the interest.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of implication on the CS budget.
Thank you, Jim.
Sorry, because it was. John.
Thank you.
Then
Could I ask on page 91, the bottom bullet point 22.3, about £450,000 procurement savings are linked to tendering and contract management efficiencies that are dependent on council-wide reductions being realised and offered up departmentally. To what extent either do we potentially have double counting there within the departments and council-wide, and also separately, how realistic is it to put those in as an achievable target? Essentially, as Councillor Hammond was saying, that if it's reliant on other departments, can it be put as a? Is it more in the? If it's above the line, it's a nice to have if we get it, but actually because it's so reliant on other departments.
Yeah, sure. No, I agree. I think there's a sort of tension there. We have the sort of support services department who are supporting departments across the council with contract renegotiation, procurement, and there's a sort of reasonable expectation that given the size of the contract spend across the council that we ought to be able to save a small percentage of it. And so the procurement team are looking at the sort of pipeline of contracts that are either at their break clause or up for renegotiation or re-tender, and supporting those departments to realise savings at the point at which they're let. And so this is an estimate of a sort of, let's say 1% across all contracts that we ought to be able to save. But until you're actually at the point of tendering, evaluating and tendering and awarding those contracts, you're unable to put those specific savings in those home departments until they're let. I think what's happened is there have been some delays on some of those, tender exercises where we might have expected to see some, bigger returns. The procurement saving is now sitting underneath the commercialisation, transformation and savings work stream, and we're supporting them to work with officers across the council to unlock some of those savings. So we're expecting they'll be delivered in 25-26 and just given.
So perhaps when you come to challenge the savings for next year, these areas need even more scrutiny. Can I just ask a couple of other questions? On page 26, staffing costs in the table has net capitalisation. Can you explain what capitalisation of the staffing cost is? So it's the housing revenue account, expenditure, staffing costs, brackets, net.
Can you just say what page it was again?
Page 26. Oh, sorry, 122.
That's
sorry.
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Sorry.
Good. Sorry, not getting mad, always cheering.
122. In the table in 12.1, the table 11, the second in the white box, staffing cost brackets, net capitalisation.
Yeah, so a number of members of staff in the housing revenue account work on capital projects to deliver, the major schemes, and therefore we're able to capitalise some of the staff costs for the time spent working on those capital programmes.
So actually, it means it goes on to capital side of the budget as opposed to revenue.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. And then just one last question, and treble 1, 6.10. When I read that paragraph, it basically, correct me if I'm wrong, it basically said that what we had been asking for wasn't good enough, and as a result, we went back to square one. And what's been the cost of essentially starting from it again from scratch? So let's go back to Councillor Hudd's question, which is, it's not just a slippage, it's a reprofiling or rescoping. And actually, what's the true cost of this?
So I would have to take what's the true cost away, because there might not be a financial cost, it might just be a time cost. It depends what's written into the contract. So I think you just need to take that in detail.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Which is one of the most jargon-filled paragraphs I've ever read.
Yes.
Let's let that pass in the interest of amity. Claire.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about sections 5, 8 and 9, which are pertaining to various aspects of Grenfell spending. Looking at number 5 on page 109, we seem to have, we seem to have a corporate underspend of 100,000. And I'm struggling to see from paragraph 5.3 how that relates to the 100,000 other corporate costs. So we have legal costs, which is an underspend.
Yes.
And corporate costs then
An overspend of 147,000, and then the two added together gives you an overall underspend of 100,000 on the total of what we call Grenfell corporate revenue budgets.
So paragraph 5.2 refers to the first line in the table, is that right? And 5.3 the second.
Overall, for these 3 paragraphs, the thing that is concerning to me is whether, and it's a little bit difficult for a lay person to sort of tease this out, is it the case that we have money that was budgeted, say, for Grenfell response and recovery, seemingly just go into reserves and disappear? Because where we talk about on page 9.1 on page 117, we talk about Grenfell recovery. Now that was a strategy that was over 5 years, and then of course COVID came in 2020. So after the first year, to all intents and purposes, the delivery of that was kind of paused. And where we have underspend, it bothers me that might be somehow going into reserves. When it was actually, that's what troubles me. And I think when we talk about the curved legacy, I think that's if I understand correctly, that's going into reserves just because of delays around the delivery of what's happening there. And then one piece that's bothering me a lot is at 8.11 on I didn't write to say 113. Page 116. It seems to me this report is saying that His Majesty's government has not supplied that portion of the global settlement agreement that was agreed as a legal agreement, that the government have not yet honoured their part of it. So what I'm understanding is that that is being mitigated somehow by the council, pending the resolution of that. And do we think we have a time frame on when the government might pay? We don't.
I can answer the last question. So you're right, we are still working that through with MHCLG. And the council aren't funding that at all at the moment. We're waiting for that to be resolved. And as their ongoing conversations at the moment, there's not really any more I can say.
Because not having that amount would kind of cause a temporary shortfall. But if I've understood correctly, we haven't got to that level of the spending yet for it to have become an
so that's a long time then.
Yeah. And then just finally, and this is the last one, Mary, this may not be a question for you, but I think it does need asking. On page 113, which is kind of the background of what the Future Grenfell Support Programme is, it says its aim is to provide ongoing collective support, partly to help mitigate some of the challenges that can arise when individual claims are paid. Now, as the ward councillor, that's news to me, and I'm very curious as to what those challenges might be. So, do we think that might be a question that I should be asking Joe Phil? Yeah.
I think you want the details, that's probably best to ask.
I will do then, thank you.
We can pick up some of the other questions you asked.
Yeah, sure. So the Grenfell corporate budget is the sort of there's a section in 5.3 around the insurance costs, and they did come from reserves. So that was funded from reserves. I think the underspend relates to parts of the council's budget for administrative costs that are outside of the Grenfell, sort of ring-fenced budgets. This is just our own internal base budget for administrative costs, and there might be an underspend, but it's just part of the council's base budget. And the insurance costs came from the reserve. To match that 555% that is referenced in paragraph 523.
Yeah.
And then the other understanding of the Grenfell sections were transferred into reserves, including a newly created Grenfell Resource and Justice Reserve, so that's clearly identified.
I think that would have to be because it's a legal agreement. What concerns me is other things transferred into reserves in previous years that may not necessarily be ring-fenced.
So these are the accounts, and there's a draft accounts, and you've got a number of elements in there, and I'm happy to sit down with you and go through the Grenfell elements. But as Lucy said, you've got the new Grenfell Restorative Justice Reserve in there, you've got Grenfell Reserve in there, you've got the civil claims settlement, you've got the legacy as well. All of those different reserves are set. And we can talk you through, if it's helpful, the balance at the start of the year and you transferred in and out during the year to give you a closing balance. That would be really helpful. Yeah, a table and then send it to you, and then if you've got any questions,
that would be fantastic.
Let's do that.
Thank you.
And share it with the whole committee. Well,
Thank you, Chairman. Well, we have 5.2 million underspent in general. And we have cuts, similar number of cuts this year, 45 million, I think so. That's maybe real from past experience. It says let's go through the reserves. On page 107, we have 8 million and 0.086,000 from capital program, investment, housing and social investment capital program, and the spend this year in a year. The underspend is a big concern to me because it's been happening as long as I remember, and we have cuts. Schools on page 72, we have 841,000 pounds underspend. In a borough, we have 1/4 of our children living in poverty. Can't this money be diverted where it's needed instead of? And the question is, when you say saving, this underspend considered saving?
So I think you're muddling up a couple of things. If I can help try and explain them. So the overall underspend was the council's general fund. The reference you make to the 8.086 million capital, and we have to keep them separate. The capital is again relating to an underspend at that time. It might create a slippage as well. And then the reference on page 72 that you make is against the dedicated schools grant, which is a ring-fenced grant. So if we do underspend against that, then we ring-fence it particularly for schools. And that's whether that be high needs element of schools, primary or early years, but it's ring fence for school spending. So we can't just move that off and spend it on other elements of children's social care. So there's 3 things going on there. There's the outturn generally, which is general fund. There's the capital element, which is the 8.086 million. And then there's the BSG element, section 1.9 on page 72.
So the capital could be used for investment, not there.
The capital will be used in the future. That's back to the conversation we were having earlier around slippage and timing delays.
But the projects will go ahead, but just later, we'll probably they just go ahead, but later. Right.
Can I,
Last
sorry,
question.
just on following on, from that, can I then in that case understand paragraph 1.2 on page 71, which talks about the general fund revenue budget?
Yeah.
Seems to say there's an overspend of 5.207 million, which will be transferred to reserves.
Yeah.
But is that not the point that Mo was making? Because we had cuts.
So if you remember back to Q3 monitoring, we were predicting an overspend, we were predicting pretty much break even. We've obviously tightened our spend and tried to be more efficient and effective in the last quarter of the year, which has created the underspend. And that 5.207 million at paragraph 1.2 is general fund underspend revenue, and we've transferred that in two slightly different ways. We've transferred the bulk of it, 4.8 million, to the budget stabilisation reserve, which can be used for general fund budget, and then we've transferred an element, 381,000, to car parking reserve because it relates to ring fence car parking income. So that money, the bit you're talking about, Councillor Simons, is definitely around general funds.
Thank you. Thank you. That clarifies things.
I had one question. Oh, Toby, sorry.
No, it's usually worth seeing what you're going to ask me. But this is really to inform something that might end up being better going to council committee.
Yeah.
And really, as usual, it's a bit to straighten my own mind out. So in terms of S106 spending and so on, but I mean, particularly S106, I mean, we spent more than we took in, right? For the year. What I'm wondering about with S106, and I often wonder if sitting on planning committees, right? Because the nature of the payment, what they're essentially there to do, well, is you can't build social housing, you're going to do something else. I think there's a general feeling that it sort of just goes into the void. It sort of ends up, money just sort of goes into this pot somewhere and no one quite knows what happened. And out and see what's happened to it. But given the amount that's sort of been accrued over the years, I'm wondering what the actual policy, if there's any ring fencing, is regardless. Because I also know that, for example, if I was to be really impacted by development next to mine, and then someone says, well, it's being spent on something, I'd like to know what the criteria are, what's ring fenced, if anything, all that kind of stuff. So I'd really like to come back with some details on that.
We can give you an overarching answer.
Right.
Lucy's close to this, she'll give you an overarching
Great.
answer. And then if you wanted to drill down into any particular section 106 lines.
It does, yeah. Well, it does feel a bit like, just putting what my colleague Councillor Backchat was saying, at least in print, that it's sort of, this feels like it's money that should be spent on things that are directly, right.
We'll look up the general answer.
Appreciate it.
That'll be helpful.
Shall I just read my other
Got another question.
Another question, which is you probably won't be able to answer, but it's on section 20.9, which is the same section about the transformation savings work programme. There's a decision that's going to be made on using the silver bands to pay into more capital projects which are infrastructure related. And I just want to know when there's going to be a decision announced about that. If there's sort of a when by kind of situation, I'd like to know.
Yeah, on the section 106 question, each section 106 agreement has quite a specific set of requirements around how we'll mitigate the impact of the development, and then officers across the council work with planning colleagues to think about the best way to offset the impact of that development. And there's quite specific uses of that money, and I think historically there might be expectations of how that money would be used that then actually didn't necessarily come to fruition. And I think there's been a lot of work over the last 4 or 5 years to really tighten up that joint working so that money that comes in now is a much more well-defined use, and they're much clearer about the timeframes for delivery. So in some cases it's quite loosely worded in the sense that that money is available, and officers across the council look at all of these various pots of money when, for example, their capital business case. So the capital board has specific parts in its business case template, ensuring that people have sort of made those investigations with section 116 first. Every single contribution the council's received has a spend manager allocated to it. So that's someone out in that sense, whether it be highway, whether it be schools, whether it be arts. And there's a quarterly meeting of spend managers and planning colleagues to run through all of those potential kind of uses and where they're at in that planning. So what we sort of see here is money we had, money we've received, money we've spent, money we've still got. But of that money we've still got, there are quite a big number that are allocated for future projects already, sort of in the background. That paperwork's been done, it's sort of waiting for it to come to delivery.
Is there a way I could be able to track that in the future? I mean, if I could go onto the KNC Hub or whatever and just have it like we do with, certain other.
Yes, I think all section 106 agreements and sort of detail are online, but that might be reading each individual agreement, which would be quite an undertaking. We could perhaps look if it's we can provide a more digestible summary of what's already earmarked for projects in the future as opposed to just unallocated at present.
I would find that really helpful for one. So
Thank you. Okay, Will, you got a question?
Yes, page 78, table 1, general fund revenue budget. It struck me reading through this. First type of question is, original budget is presumably the budget struck by the leadership team in the January-February decision certified by council in the February council meeting. The revised budget, there's no date on that or no real rationale on that, and we haven't actually understood that during the year as far as I recall, which presumably takes on pressures. And it presumably also takes on clarification by government as to how much they're going to give us. The NHS is going to indirectly give us and such like. So is that the way to read this, that the original budget is best estimates in February? So the revised budget is dreadful, which has come in plus the pressures.
Yeah.
And then the final outturn is the final outturn. And the variance is a big difference between the revised budget and the final outturn.
Yes, but if I can just add a little bit more clarity.
Yep,
So,
please.
original budget, you're absolutely right, was what we signed off, a leadership team and then full council in February and March. Revised budget, as you say, is changes throughout the year, so that might be additional grant monies coming in or revised income projections. I think one of the recommendations you made at this group previously is to track those changes in the budget from original to revised. So really at quarter 3, we put a schedule, into Lucy just for clarification, we put a schedule into the outturn, the monitoring report at that point to show you all the changes, and we'll continue.
You have done, you will do.
We have done, and we'll continue to do that throughout next year. The final outturn is what actually happened at the end of the year, and as you say, the variance is the final outturn compared to the revised budget. So we're going to make the movement between original budget and revised budget, which we did at quarter 3 and will continue to do, transparent for you, so you can see how it's moved from one number to another.
Because when we raised the question in the 3rd of July meeting with FCS, we were not able to get an explanation. It's too early, we were told, to why the overspend estimates have been mitigated before the end of the year, because Mary at the time pointed out it's crucial for us to understand whether there's overspends during the year we've found cemented into the baseline for the budget for 25/6, or whether it would not. At that stage in July, they were not able to answer that. It strikes me as a bit difficult for us to understand what's happening in 25/6 in the progress reports. We can't understand what the base budget, whether it includes embedded pressures from last year or not, by the time you're meeting in July. So if there's anything can be done to bring those calculations forward a bit, maybe this is a result of the change of the computer system you're working with and the rest of it. But going forward for next year, it's really good to have that information at the beginning of the year.
Okay,
So
just
that's part of the question I want to
on
ask.
that. So just a quick update on that. So when we are setting the budget, one of the things we absolutely look at is pressures, which we call growth. And you'll remember when you see the budget report, there's a whole schedule on growth that requires. And one of the ways we look at that is to say, what are we forecasting for the previous year? I wasn't at the Children and Family Services Committee, so I don't quite know that conversation. But we certainly, we certainly do try and make sure that we are reflecting what's previously happened, otherwise the gap will just get greater.
Right, and I think this is particularly important because there are lots of figures being bandied around, but the sort of scale of pressures for this year, depending on what the government actually decides to do, but around, it's not 8 billion, it's sort of 25 million this time, so it looks big. And knowing what quantum this report.
Thank you, Will. I think.
So can I please finish? Right, knowing what quantum would be of the last year in this information, the quantum of what transformations have contributed to enable saving.
Right, Joanna, you had another question.
Just on that table one, I think it would be helpful in the variance column to say variance against revised budget in the heading. But I think it would also be very useful to have a separate table to actually show us the variance against the original budget, particularly for this quarter end, i.e. quarter 4, so that we can actually look at how far, because when you do look at that table, some of them have gone back from, as in they're nearer their original budget than their revised budget. So I think it would be very helpful to have a paragraph with the table with the figures and a paragraph just explaining, just so that we can see that actually it's moved by 100 million or it's moved by 5 million overall.
If we have included in that clarity with regards to the use of reserves coming in, and that we're putting the money to reserves after an unspent at the end too, if the reserves in and out.
So shall we recommend that you consider that, and if it's impractical,
I think what we need to do with these tables is keep them simple, because otherwise they get so wide we can't fit them on the page, and then we can't read them, you can't read them. When we do the final accounts, which is what I keep picking through here, they are available on the council's website. There is a narrative report at the front of the accounts that actually does talk about final outturn and adjusted and all sorts of various things. So there's more detail, as you can see in there.
I was just talking about
we can have some words.
A quarter four chart that literally has it only has the original budget column versus the revised budget, i.e. so you can see the beginning of the budget, i.e. the original budget versus where we land up to, and then a column that just says plus or minus, so that it's just a big column table without showing. I appreciate the accounts. I didn't think this committee sees the accounts, but maybe that's something to provide.
no doubt some people do nothing but pour over them from the moment that they're published, but I'm not one of them.
Audit transparency.
The Audit and Transparency Committee. I think it's worth maybe trying next time to see if we find it. I'm conscious of not expanding reports, to see if we find it useful. So can we recommend that we push the table in and have the table separately maybe for us, even if it's not in your outturn report, because we don't think everyone will find it useful.
Yeah, so the next report is really useful to one. We can certainly have a look. As I say, there'll be that schedule that takes you from original budget to revised budget and tells you all those movements, and then we can certainly do something that shows outturn against original budget and outturn against revised budget.
It says the difference between the original budget and the revised budget, which I think Dana has wanted to track and to also see how significant those changes are. I suppose.
So that schedule will do that for you. I think that's there, but we can pick it into this table as well if that's helpful.
Yeah, I suppose one thing to note that should be drawn out in there is you'll start the year with contingency and centrally held budgets in a pot, and then as inflation and other sort of decisions are made, they move to the lines above. And I think that's why sometimes if you put a variance compared to visual budget, they'd all just be very big plus and very big minuses, because money's held in one place and distributed based on the contingency budget was granted to health, adult, social and children's and allocated to those departments in the year. So we just need to think about making that meaningful rather than just being really big plus and minuses. But I'm sure we can come up with something.
I think you read sort of 17.2 and you give yourself a pat on the back because it's a 7.207 million underspend, but actually the budget went up to 195 million, and I don't know where the budget started from. So actually, is it in truth that actually we've got up 10 million in spend, but we're giving ourselves a pat on the back because the headline figure is -5 million. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Okay.
So I appreciate that what you've done is you put stuff in your back pocket that you can roll out, so your budget. But I think it's very hard to digest and to
I agree.
to spit it out.
So very quickly, looking at table 1, your original budget was 195.8 million in the first column of numbers.
Yeah.
The revised budget was 195.1 million. So you can see the movement there.
Yep.
Outturn was 189 million, which gives the 5 million underspent. I'm happy to have a look at whether we can present that slightly differently, but I think the schedule showing you the movement from originally to revised is probably the thing that you'll find most useful, which you don't get in this report on that one.
Yeah, and the difference really between the original budget and the revised budget on the bottom line is the net transfer to and from reserves. So somebody going into the reserves, somebody coming out of the reserves, and that's the sort of final total. But yeah, we can absolutely look at it.
It's got the money going out to reserves, but it doesn't have the money going from reserves.
It has both in the revised budget.
So above in the top half of that table, before you get down to the last 2 lines, it's got the movements in year. The last 2 lines are the transfers out at the end of the year into reserves. So again, if you look in the accounts, there's a whole schedule of reserves, and it shows you all the things coming in on each line. And it's a total figure, but it'll show you a plus and a minus of in and out.
And it's something we can discuss further.
Lucy, you have one more question you wanted to ask.
Thank you, Chair. A very quick one. Page 84. It was 18.8. Why the dramatic decline in the capital program contingency? Page 84.
Yeah.
18.8.
Yeah.
If you look at the contingency, it starts off at 697, goes down to 546, and then why such dramatic decline? I just was trying to understand it.
So it's been allocated to projects. Yeah. So it starts off as a contingency because we're not sure where we need to allocate it, and then as the year goes on, we've allocated it out to capital projects.
Thank you. I have one quick final question, and that's on page 93. It talks about new requests for additional funding. And it seems to be, it's in the reserve section. Surely, does that not affect our underspend? Why is it in the reserve section?
I think it might say this a bit nearer the beginning of the report, but honestly, because of the timing, we have assumed this use of reserve and it's for approval by the leadership team. So if they were to not approve this use of reserve that's come forward as a request in the 4th quarter, then that would change that.
So we've taken stuff out of reserve as well as put stuff in reserves. Right.
Yeah.
Something like
So this is not the 5.207. So this is on each sort of departmental line, whether it be in our neighbourhoods or children's social. We're saying these are all the different uses of reserves that have been approved through reporting the monitoring reports over the years,
Right.
and these are all the transfers to the reserves that have been approved. And then the final outturn is 5.2 million underspend, and we transfer that as reserves.
Okay.
It's sort of separate.
Thank you. Good. So thank you very much for that. Let's move on to item. No, is it 5 or 6? No, 6. Forward planning key decisions, and then we're going to go to the work programme, which we mustn't skip too hard before we get to. It's very important. Reset and Lisa, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, forward planning key decisions. Right, and we're going to fall through the pages. 1, 5, 2, 3.
Sorry. I just wanted to bring our attention to on page 1, the supported housing strategy, and also on page 20, the contract for medium to high housing service for vulnerable women and men with complex needs. The reason why I want to bring our attention to that is the extent to which it feeds into the Earlsbourne Council Support Action and the working group that we had last year on housing and communities. But it might be something, I don't know whether it would be this or my committee, but I wanted to flag that one up, perhaps to whether we could have conversation about that.
I think they probably would go to your committee.
Yes, supported housing strategy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and also the contract award for medium to high housing service for vulnerable women and men, because I'm just thinking about the recommendations from that working group. And we would want to see that they were being implemented.
It was on page 20, had you said?
Yeah.
What is 172 of the main numbers?
It's page 20 is the landscape orientation.
Page 172.
It's landscape.
I think it's
172.
Approval of contract awards for 5 housing service for vulnerable women, is that what you said?
Yeah, and that's in September 2025.
for progress to your commission. Page 2.
Yeah.
Yep.
I was wondering about the council's response to the external review of the council's resilience functions and whether we need more to do that in the OSC.
Yes, me too.
We put that in.
Yeah, I'll have a look.
Okay.
I'll get the information.
Thank you. 3. Good spot. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9,
Sorry. PSPO is right at the very bottom of page 7 and over this page there. PSPO looks quite interesting, sort of OSD type.
We talked.
Is that a renewal?
That was discussed at the last meeting. I asked, I had a note from officers, and you decided that you didn't want to scrutinise that. It is a renewal. There's been a bit of a lapse in it, and there's been some
because it's a renewal, Rob, that's why I think we decided to do
That's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, no, that's fine.
Yeah.
Ignore me. It's time.
This time. Don't take that as a. Right, sorry. 9, 10. Sorry.
I'm very interested in passenger transport. I'm just looking at that. It's the contract, 2-year extension. And I think I'm just flagging it because I'm concerned with anyway, so.
Sorry.
So is this the one on page 9 variation?
Yeah.
It's it's an extension of 1 year for the current contract to start the approach. I mean, I just want to keep an eye on it.
That would be for family services.
Yeah.
So I'll find information.
Page 11.
Again, sorry. Page 11, first under housing. Because I'm still quite finding it difficult to read these. 31st of March was the decision, KD 10108. Okay. It's the succession and assignment of tenants and policy. I don't know how that's energy. I don't know how it's going to be. I don't know what I want to know what they're thinking.
Okay. 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18.
Can I mention? Sorry, so sorry.
No, it's fine. So I'm just.
Can I just mention a strategy and award in connection with internal refurbishments at Lancaster West Estate, in the context of my committee's recent recommendations on that. So I want to flag that up, if possible, that we maybe need to have a little briefing or something ties in with our recommendations.
Which page was that?
Sorry,
170. 170.
18.
Yeah, I've got it. So you might need to brief me.
Oh, sorry. Yes, please.
19, 20, 21.
I'm sorry, on 19, we do have repairs, and it has been the subject of a big item. So it's the bottom of page 19. The housing fire ride repairs, I think, particularly for housing community. I think repairs is on our agenda.
Yes, it is.
If we could just flag that one in there as well.
Thank you. Go ahead, please, Jackie.
Yep, got that.
20, 21. 22, 23. 24, 25. 26, 27. 28. 29. 30. 31. 33. 33.
Apologies, Mary, I think we need to 25 libraries and archives transformation action plan. Is that going to be bridged? Is that coming down to FCS or?
Libraries and archives transformation action plan, that would come within the terms of reference for family service.
Yeah. Do we do?
Do you want that one?
No, well, there's no need for it to come with this committee.
No, but if you wanted it to come to
Yeah,
yours.
we go to us.
You do want that one then?
Yeah.
I'll put that down, yeah.
33, 34, 35.
Can I just add, I'm confused nosiness, I don't want it to be exclusive, but I would like to know about it. It was the Lane Metal scheme on page 33. It's not for a committee. It's the utilities you can rent out of Lane, particularly at Nottingham. And so just out of interest, okay, because that would be for environment. I can get more information, but we'll just that.
Yeah, I don't think I wanted to comment.
No, but I can find out more information.
Yeah. 34, 35, 36.
Did anybody know about this fire and voice alarm? Because it came up in our papers earlier. And then
So
it's page 35. The retrospective decision for the incurred costs of the handled fire and voice alarm refurbishment project.
This looks like a contractual dispute to me.
Does anybody know what committee this comes under?
Property.
Yeah, is it on anybody's
I
radar? I think that would come here, would it? Incurred costs of traffic for use.
The FM contract, does that come to us or to?
Well, the scrutiny of the FM contracts has been here.
Okay.
I'd be happy for the chairman to put that. That decision's been taken. I think.
So the horse has bolted. Is that the?
I think so. You were contacted, but it is a retrospective decision. Yeah, don't worry about it. Okay.
No, sorry. Before we move on, can I just make sure Jackie's got, there are two items here pertaining to the Lancaster West estate refurbishment. One of them is internal, and one of them is mechanical and electrical works.
Which page is
So that's
that?
page 20, and this is page 18. 18 was the first one I mentioned.
Right, I've got page
18.
Yeah, I've got page 18.
And
I've
there's
now
also
got page 20.
Weird.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Which page are you on?
Well, I was going to boldly move on to 36.
Right, my message is on 36.
More in hope than expectation.
Right,
Has to be said.
the proposed award of a new 10-year contract. If that means. Is that going to be a 10-year contract or?
Hard services, Rob.
No, the car, Ample car park award money.
Yeah.
I mean, the question there is as to, aren't we reviewing the whole use of the town hall? The property is, and in that case, they don't want to lock themselves into contract.
Where does it say 10 years?
No, it doesn't say 10 years, misread it. But the question there is, I mean, again, it doesn't need to come back here, just find out
You want to prove it?
that the property are not locking themselves on being locked into being unable to repurpose the town hall.
37. Do you think the better way of doing this would be, rather than me calling through the pages, is to ask everyone to come furnished with anything they want to talk about?
As long as 36 pages or 37 pages, yes, not normally this long, is it?
Oh, it often feels this long.
It sort of feels like we're playing charades at the end of the, nothing.
What do you think, Jasmine?
Yeah, that's
Because there are a lot of
that's the way of doing it. But
it's because there are a lot of housing policies they're taking up.
Yeah.
Yeah, there have been a lot flying, you're absolutely right. But I think Yusuf had one more that he
Yes,
circulated.
The future of St Cuthbert and St Matthias Church of England Primary School. It's going further to the conclusion of a 6-week consultation led by the governing body of St Cuthbert and St Matthias Church of England Primary School, if recommended by the governing body to the intention of the council to publish a statutory notice receipt of a formal 4-week consultation and a proposal to close the school in accordance with Section 15 the Education Inspection Act 2006 and the School Organisation, Establishment and Discontinuance of Schools Regulation 2013. Following the formal consultation period and having fully considered any representations received, the council will make a decision on whether to implement the closure of the school or not. And that decision is due to be made by the leadership team on the 24th of September. The next meeting of the OSC is on the 17th of September. So, does the committee wish to? Consider it or
FCS to
FCS.
FCS link the day after leadership team, but it could be considered in another way.
Circulate it.
Yeah, could do.
Is that the other one? Yeah, okay, so let's circulate that to that particular.
I mean, in essence, if the evidence is there and the governors have made a decision, the consultation happening, all we've got to do is actually is to make the due processes.
Yes.
So you do want it circulated?
Sufficient information for us to be satisfied with due processes.
That should be in the key decision.
Yeah, could be in the key decision.
But equally, though, there'll be public feeling about it. So every time there's a strong public feeling about it, and
I think
this is our platform for that sort of views to be aired. And I completely appreciate it might be the logical decision and the right decision when the time comes.
Yeah, I think it's right. Well, I mean, what you're saying is that the select committee is a place where people can come and
have their views on it,
and it's up to officers to make a case.
Yes,
and so maybe we should have it.
Well, if you have it, well, you either need to move the date of your meeting because it's there after leadership team, have an additional meeting,
yeah,
or it comes here. I mean, the September agenda is quite full.
Yeah.
But those are
Well, what do you advise? I mean, I've seen a lot of the evidence obviously in schools or like so. I can see that people are very passionate about it.
Do you want to discuss it? Do you want to take it out here and discuss what you want to do with it with Jackie?
Yeah,
because I don't think the committee, as a committee, we need to. I'll let you decide.
So if we think it needs to, or better just come to with it.
very particularly that's a.
Yeah. I don't think we
have another
meeting.
Well, you can sort of move your meeting if there's a free date, because you're meeting the day after leadership team. So rather than having another meeting, thinking of council time, you could always move that meeting.
Well, I think, yeah, okay, let's discuss it outside.
Should we have a chat with David about it?
Yeah, okay. So let's move on to our work programme. Jackie, can you guide me through this one?
Okay. Included in this report is the draft work programme for overview and scrutiny, plus the work programmes for the four select committees, because this committee reviews all of the work programmes, just looks for interpretation or synergies, so I thought we should have something about for joint working. Also within the report is some information about next steps for finance and budget scrutiny and an amendment to the terms of reference of the budget working group. Finally, there is the annual review scrutiny ways of working, which has some information in about impacts, including the recommendations that have been made over the last year for the committee and how many have been accepted. And that includes the information from the budget working groups in there as well.
Turning to 3.4, which is our own, this committee's thing, I just wanted to make a couple of suggestions. One is that we take zero-based budgeting as category because it's going to the budget working group. And the other is to rephrase the first bullet point to how the council can ensure that it does simple things right. Because it looks a bit pat on the back as it is, which is not what the course is intended at all. And that's not only thoughts on the OSC. What else do we actually need to decide?
We did discuss in the pre-meeting, but the zero-based budgeting, the first thing would have to be a briefing paper on what zero-based budgeting is.
Yes.
And that would come from, presumably from Lisa's. Are you okay to do that, a briefing paper on what zero-based budgeting?
Or we might, if we choose an outside person to help us with that.
Yes. Right.
Ask them to do the briefing paper.
Yeah. But I think we ought to have it well in advance because we need to get up to speed on it.
If you agree to do it, I can arrange a briefing paper.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I think, if I may.
Yes, sorry, I forgot we were still lurking.
I was
to make sure we didn't go too astray on this one.
So I think we can certainly do something, obviously, alongside this, we're looking at the transformation and the savings as well. So it's going to be about capacity with all of this, but we can certainly do a briefing note on what zero-based.
Well, we had thought that we would get outside support for this one, for this particular task.
So I guess there's a cost associated with that, and you know whether that's something.
Well, we have a budget which we don't use much of.
Yeah. Maybe it's something we should talk about, Jackie.
Yes, I'm very happy for you to. I mean, part of the idea of using outside help is because you have, there must be capacity issues within your team, and also maybe it's a good idea to have a fresh pair of eyes on this. So both would be achieved by using outside help. I can see the producers already think that we're going to spend lots of money and good. Okay. So what else do we have to decide?
Mary, another point I want to bring up on the budget working group that we're saying, this is a question of definition of witnessy, or whether there's an overlap between audit transparency and ourselves. The analysis of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Sort of SWOT analysis of the council position. Is that mainly a responsibility of A&T or this?
You mean budget scrutiny?
But it's to do with budget. Some people would say that we're facing, at the worst case, an existential threat from central government.
Well, I'm actually having a meeting with my colleague in with the Audit and Transparency Committee, so why don't I stick that on the agenda?
Right.
Well, next
week, that meeting.
And you can give us a view as to which bit of that subject.
To make sure we put that on the agenda.
Yeah, I will.
Perfect. Great. You had a question.
I did, yes. I'm on table 1 on page 194. You have already mentioned this, maybe Jackie did, that the September meeting looks unachievably full, whereas the October meeting is rather light. Maybe there's an opportunity to shift 1 or 2 things from September to October.
Yes, I could see if social investment could go into there, but also it was projects that the workshop committee identified, some of them could possibly go into there. The committee was interested in a paper on human resources. Transparency was discussed. I think we've discussed zero-based budgeting, and I think how the council can ensure it does some things well as a long project. So it might be possible to put the human resources paper in there.
Well, we're certainly interested in those things, but we don't want to be sat here till 10:30 p.m. on the 17th of September.
No, so maybe get rid of some of it.
So I am already in discussions with colleagues about moving things around if I can. I was asked if in November I could keep it clear for Grenfell, so I'm trying to get the annual complaints report moved into October, but some of the reports have dependencies with other meetings, so I'm onto it.
Jackie, you mentioned maybe I misunderstood what you said, but the zero-based budgeting one needs to come as soon as possible.
Yes. So on page 197, items to be scheduled, what's relevant schedule of extra care units for adult social care. That has an asterisk. And the asterisk says in coordination with this committee.
That was the request from adult social care, so that's that Lucy was going to speak to that, but she can't come. They've identified that as a project and wondered if it could come here because of in a way that Maxilla has, because it's putting lots of different strands together.
But we reckon our agenda is quite full, so it's going to be difficult.
Just going back to table 1, in the 7th, I mentioned it earlier, the Oracle product closure report.
Yeah.
What I was asking, which I didn't ask, is Oracle computers IP really important, that looks like it's just a one-off because it's got the word closure report in it. Whereas I was asking whether the Oracle would be looked at and reviewed annually for here so that we can understand if there are any problems and flag them early to do with our.
But we discussed that before. We could suggest that we need annual updates.
Can I suggest you might want to include it in your discussion with audit and transparency, because it might be for that committee.
Yeah.
So you might want, that might be one of the things to discuss.
The reason I mention it here, of course I will mention it again in audit where I sit, is because if you look at Birmingham City Council, almost 114, 3/4 of the money seems to be from the IT transformation. So I'm extremely concerned.
So colleagues here or officers feel that with some of the implementation is very differently to Birmingham. We've done a much less bespoke, is that fair enough? Much more off the shelf implementation.
If I can just add very, very quickly, so I did it, I was the senior responsible officer for the Oracle project. A lot of the issues that you're referring to from Birmingham was the way they designed the system, so they adapted it rather than adopted it. We took the approach to adopt, not adapt. So that means we're taking it very much more out of the box. And therefore, Oracle is a system that is regularly updating every quarter. And when Oracle release those quarterly updates, by adopting it rather than adapting it, it's much quicker and much easier to do those quarterly updates. In Birmingham, because they adapted it rather than adopted it, when they came to do the updates, it was much more difficult. I'm not saying it's easy by any means, but we had that in mind, and so we tried to follow that adopt, not adapt process throughout. The closure report will give you an update on how we implemented projects and lessons learned, particularly to take forward for future projects as well. And then, we're in a business as usual state now. We finished hypercare, which is the 3-month period from go live. Yesterday, we successfully, overnight, we successfully ran our fourth payroll, which was a good place to be. So I'm not saying everything's perfect by any means, but it's up and running. There are a few glitches that we're just ironing out. There's a massive culture change for the organisation that's adopting Oracle, but we are thinking of the place at the moment. But we'll bring that report to you in September.
Fantastic. So all I was requesting, Chair, was that we would have an annual report on all of the updates and the process and the progress of that. Make sure we keep an eye on it.
So I suggest that in that meeting, when we have that report, we make that request. And it actually doesn't need to be a kind of 30-page report. It could just be a
2-page.
Exactly. And if that's what the committee decides, then perfect. Yep, very happy to do that. Any other comments on your work? Anything else we need to decide?
Just on page 199, it was to amend the terms of reference to the budget working group, paragraph 4.1. It just, 4.2 is the amended terms of reference because it just recognises the role of the select committees in scrutinising budget proposals. But that is not the way of working when the budget working is set up.
Are you all happy with that?
Can I just check something?
Yeah.
On page 192, paragraph 3.3. Those 3 items, except for the zero-based budgeting, are we agreeing that those will be added into the work programme?
Into the OSC work programme,
yes.
But we haven't got dates for them yet.
No.
And we also haven't got a scope for them, which we'll have to agree.
We need to scope them.
Scope them out, say what we're actually going to discuss, because HR is kind of an enormous.
They're all potentially quite large subjects.
Exactly, and we are short of time.
And you can always have things that you definitely want to do, and then have a reserve list as the select committees. You have a watching brief. So,
can we have the zero-based budgeting on the 17th of September?
I can get a briefing note on zero-based budgeting. If what you're asking me this evening is you want a briefing note on what is it, I can get that. I can either talk to Lisa about it, or as Mary suggested, I can commission it. So you can have the briefing note as soon as it's written, and then it's how you want to.
We can actually circulate it outside.
That can be circulated outside of this.
So it doesn't need to stick to the meeting dates.
No.
Jack and I will discuss how best to commission it.
Yeah.
With Lisa looking penny pinching me over our shoulders.
A scrutiny project, not
Yes.
So if you think there's too many from 3.4 from Claire's question, you can say you definitely want to do zero-based budgeting, and it's whether the others are on the reserve list.
But zero-based budgeting is going into the
It's
budget
just
working
the
group.
budget work.
Yeah, so there's 3 left over, and I'm just checking, are they all ideally going to be on the list, and if they're not, we have an order of preference.
Well, when Jackie's done her rejigging of the meetings, we might have a better idea of whether we can fit them all in. And maybe we'll have identified one that we think is disposable out of all of those.
What are you intending or thinking about with human resources?
My notebook's not with me.
People thought we hadn't discussed HR. And stuff.
If you wanted a briefing note on HR, I can get sort of briefing note.
Yes, correct. I can't remember.
It was to do with the strategy for HR for recruitment, retention, developing the workforce as things situations.
We haven't looked at it for a while. And we've had quite a big changeover of personnel at the top of HR. Given that Debbie was here for years and just now left, so it'd be quite interesting for us to see whether there's a new approach.
I mean, it could link in with transformation potentially. As a way of.
Well, let's put HR as our slightly less solid one, in the sense that we might have a briefing note rather than a publication. Okay.
Yeah, how it contributes to that.
Slightly, we've finished that, so we've, in the lack of any.
Let's do one business, something like recommendations.
Have we got any, yes, we haven't got any business. I'm close to it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
And minor analysis. Sorry.